Before the world knew his name, before a single verse of the Qur'an was revealed bearing his title, before kings sought his counsel and students traveled from distant lands to sit at his feet, he was nobody. A dark-skinned child born into chains with thick lips, calloused hands, and eyes that already seemed to see further than anyone around him. He was raised, not in marble halls adorned with silk and lamplight, but in the dust of servitude, in the silence of a slave's existence, in the kind of invisibility that the powerful impose upon those they consider beneath them. And yet, out of all the men walking the earth at that time, Allah chose him, not a king, not a warrior, not a nobleman born into privilege and comfort, a slave. That single fact should stop you in your tracks, because it tells you something profound about how Allah measures human worth, not by lineage, not by wealth, not by the color of skin or the circumstances of birth, but by the depth of the heart, the sincerity of the soul, and the quality of the wisdom that flows from a life lived in honest surrender to the truth. Luqman's story is not just history, it is a mirror, and if you look into it long enough, you will see yourself. His story begins more than 3,000 years ago, in the upper basin of the Nile, across the sun-scorched lands that today form Sudan and the southern reaches of Egypt. This was ancient Nubia, proud, layered, and caught in the grinding jaws of competing empires. The Egyptian pharaohs stretched their power relentlessly southward, extracting gold, ivory, exotic animals, and human beings from the land and its people. Slavery in this world was not racial in its foundation. It was the brutal arithmetic of conquest. When Egypt overpowered the south, Nubians became captives. When Nubians gained the upper hand in battle, Egyptians suffered the same fate. It was war that manufactured slaves. And it was the constant shadow of war that shaped the earliest years of Luqman's life. His father, Bora, was one of tens of thousands of souls reduced to bondage in this turbulent era. Into this world of chains, forced labor, and enforced silence, Luqman was born. And from his very first years, something about him was unmistakably different, something that couldn't be explained by his surroundings, something that couldn't be beaten out of him, something that quietly but stubbornly refused to be diminished by his circumstances. While other children played, he observed. While others spoke freely, he chose silence and listened with an intensity that unnerved those around him. He studied the patterns of nature with an almost supernatural attention. The movement of animals at dawn, the behavior of plants through the seasons, the texture of soil after rain, the architecture of the sky at night. Whether he worked as a shepherd, navigating the medicinal herbs of mountain terrain, or as an apprentice carpenter, learning the hidden properties of different woods, one profound truth remained constant across every version of his early life. Wisdom was forming inside him, slowly and inevitably, like a river carving its patient path through stone. He was being prepared, though neither he nor anyone around him fully understood it yet. If this story is already drawing you in, take a brief moment to subscribe and share it, because a story this extraordinary deserves to reach as many hearts as possible. By the age of 17, the transformation became visible. Luqman had developed a connection to the plant world that went far beyond anything that could be explained through ordinary observation alone. He began preparing remedies from herbs and minerals, combining them with a precision and intuition that his peers could not replicate, healing the sick in his village one by one. Word began to spread, tentatively at first, then with gathering force. First, his village spoke his name with reverence. Then the surrounding regions heard of him. He became celebrated as a healer unlike any other. People came to him with ailments that other healers had surrendered to, and they left carrying something they hadn't arrived with, hope and then health. But fame, even when earned through pure intention and genuine virtue, always creates enemies. The sorcerers and false healers of the region, those who had spent years building their influence through deception, manipulation, and the exploitation of fear, could not stand what Luqman represented. He was dismantling their authority simply by existing. He asked for nothing in return for his cures. He did not perform rituals designed to impress. He did not create mystique or demand tribute. He simply knew, and he helped. And that was more threatening to them than any rival could have been. According to some accounts, They conspired together in secret to purchase Luqman and his family from their owners and grant them freedom, on one condition, that they leave. Leave the village, leave the region, and leave the reputation they had built behind.
But other traditions tell a different and perhaps even more revealing story of how Luqman earned his freedom. One day, his master issued what seemed like a simple order: slaughter a sheep and bring back the 2 finest parts of the animal. Luqman returned carrying the heart and the tongue. The master was surprised, but perhaps assumed coincidence. He then ordered Luqman to slaughter another sheep and this time bring the 2 worst parts. Luqman placed before him the heart and the tongue again. The master's surprise turned to fury. He demanded an explanation. And Luqman, without raising his voice, without the slightest trace of defiance or performance, answered with the calm certainty of a man who has spent years thinking about the nature of things. For a person who walks the path of good, nothing in all the body is more precious and more powerful than the heart and the tongue, for it is through them that truth is felt and spoken. And for a person who walks the path of evil, nothing in all the body is more dangerous and more destructive than those same 2 things, for it is through them that corruption spreads and harm is done. The master sat in silence. He had owned this young man. He had given him orders and expected obedience. And in a single answer about 2 pieces of meat, this slave had shown him a depth of understanding that the master knew he himself did not possess. He granted Luqman his freedom on the spot. Luqman was approximately 17 or 18 years old. Freedom opened the road ahead of him. He traveled toward Egypt, a civilization of staggering complexity and ancient power. And with each new landscape came new plants to study, new remedies to discover, and new layers of understanding to add to what was already accumulating inside him. His knowledge was not merely botanical, it was spiritual. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, would later describe Luqman in words that paint a portrait of rare human depth. His thoughts run deep, he perceives the beauty in all things, his heart overflows with love, and he is a servant richly and completely blessed, with wisdom and tender affection. This was not a coincidence, it was a divine bestowal. The Qur'an itself consecrates his name in Surah Luqman, where Allah the Most High declares, "We bestowed wisdom upon Luqman." The scholars of Islam have long debated whether Luqman held the rank of prophet. The overwhelming consensus, across centuries of scholarship, across the great works of Tafsir and Islamic biography, is that he did not, but that he was something equally rare and in some ways equally consequential, a righteous servant to whom Allah granted extraordinary knowledge, a man whose wisdom transcended the boundaries of his era and whose legacy shaped the thinking of civilizations that came long after him. He stands, alongside Dul Qarnayn and Azar, among 3 figures in Islamic tradition whose prophetic status has been a subject of genuine, scholarly discussion without resolution. And some scholars have noted that after Khidr, the mysterious figure believed by many to still walk among the living after thousands of years, Luqman is said to have lived longer than any other human being whose story has been recorded. When his growing reputation reached Egypt, it drew both profound gratitude from the sick and the desperate and a focused, calculated hostility from those whose power his presence threatened. The sorcerers and false healers of Egypt subjected him to the same vicious pattern of slander that prophets and saints endure in every age and every place. First they mocked him, then they questioned his motives, then they manufactured lies, and finally they wove a conspiracy that reached the ears of the Pharaoh himself. Luqman was condemned and thrown into prison, just as the Prophet Yusuf, peace be upon him, had been before him, in that very same land for the very same reason, because truth makes tyrants uncomfortable. His years of imprisonment were not years of bitterness or spiritual collapse. Those who have read the accounts of the righteous in confinement understand something that the world outside rarely grasps. Prison walls can confine the body while leaving the soul entirely free. Luqman healed those around him who were sick. He He prayed with a consistency and depth that prison routine could not interrupt. He meditated on the nature of existence, on the patience of the prophets, on the distance between what the world offers and what Allah promises. He endured, not as a man waiting for rescue, but as a man who had already found within himself something that no prison could reach. When he was finally released, it marked the second great turning point of his long life, the first being his emancipation from slavery. As the poet Rumi might have expressed it in the language of spiritual refinement, Luqman had now been cooked by fire twice. Each suffering had not destroyed him. Each trial had deepened him.
Free once more, he turned northward. He crossed vast stretches of desert and valley with the unhurried movement of a man who belongs to the road, until Palestine opened before him, a land where prophets had walked, where the feet of the righteous had pressed into the same dust his feet now touched, where revelation had descended from the heavens and changed the course of human history. The very air of that land seemed to carry the weight of something sacred. Most Islamic scholars agree that Luqman lived during the era of the Prophet Dawud, peace be upon him, the prophet king to whom Allah gave both the Zabur and the miracle of softening iron with his hands, and that their lives overlapped meaningfully. Some accounts speak of Luqman residing in Palestine for 700 years. Others extend that figure to a full 1,000. However, one understands the timescale. The essential reality is this: these two extraordinary men existed in the same world at the same time, and what passed between them left a mark on history. The relationship between Luqman and Dawud was one of profound and reciprocal respect, a dynamic unlike almost any other recorded in Islamic tradition. A prophet king on one side, a freed slave turned sage on the other, and between them a bond built on the rarest of all foundations, the shared love of truth. When Luqman arrived in Palestine, he began attending the public gatherings of Dawud regularly, sitting and listening with the same attentiveness he had brought to the mountains and the plants of his youth. Over time, according to some accounts, he became Dawud's close assistant and trusted companion. One day, Luqman entered Dawud's private workshop unannounced. What he witnessed there stopped him completely. Dawud was engaged in one of the miraculous gifts Allah had bestowed upon him, alone among all human beings: the power to soften iron through fire and shape it with his bare hands as though it were clay. Luqman watched as the Prophet's hands moved with precise, unhurried purpose, assembling iron rings, weaving them together into interlocking formation, constructing something that had never existed in human history. Dawud was forging the world's first coat of armor. The question formed inside Luqman immediately: what is this, O Prophet of Allah? What purpose does it serve? What are you building? And the impulse to speak it rose naturally, the way any curious mind responds to witnessing something extraordinary. But then something in him paused. He remembered, not a rule, not a social convention, but a deep and lived conviction that wisdom is not merely knowing the right things. Wisdom is also knowing when not to speak. Silence at the right moment is itself a form of understanding that most people never reach. And so he sat. He watched for hours without asking a single question. He observed how the iron was heated, how it was worked, how each ring was connected to the next with practiced precision. He watched how the form gradually revealed itself, not through explanation, but through patient observation. When Dawud finally stood clothed, the completed armor turned to survey his work and declared with satisfaction that here was a mighty shield, a precious protection for the warrior in battle. Luqman had already understood everything he needed to understand, without a single word having been exchanged between them. And in that moment, having lived the lesson rather than simply heard it, he spoke what would become one of his most enduring sayings: silence is wisdom, but few are those who truly practice it. On another occasion, it was Dawud who initiated the exchange. He turned to Luqman and said with genuine curiosity, "O Luqman, I observe that you consistently withdraw from the honors and pleasures that others scramble to acquire, and yet among all the people I know, you are the most at peace and the most genuinely beloved. How did you arrive at this station?" The question was sincere. A prophet king asking a former slave how he had found something that wealth, power, and prophethood itself did not automatically provide. Luqman answered without hesitation, without elaboration, without any trace of self-congratulation. 3 things, he said. He had never lied, he had never betrayed what was entrusted to him, and he had stopped interesting himself in matters that were none of his concern. Dawud received these words with the gravity they deserved. He recognized in them not simplicity, but a concentrated distillation of lifelong discipline, the kind of moral clarity that is only possible in a person who has truly examined themselves and chosen, again and again, to live according to what they found. Though endowed with kingship and revelation, Dawud valued Luqman's counsel and sought it openly. There is something deeply moving about that. A prophet humbled by a sage. A king leaning toward a freed slave to ask how one finds peace. Luqman taught in centers of learning, gathered students around him from across the region, and shaped the thinking of generations. The man who had arrived in this world with nothing, no name, no lineage, no status, had become one of the most significant intellectual and spiritual figures of his age. After the era of Dawud drew to its close, Luqman moved onward, westward into Anatolia, the land of fertile valleys and extraordinary botanical variety, drawn by both its natural richness and the possibility of serving its people. It was there, in a busy marketplace filled with the noise and movement of ordinary life, that his third and final enslavement occurred. A nobleman, who had recently lost his own slave, was searching the crowd with urgent eyes when he spotted Luqman. Dark-skinned, walking alone, matching the description of the man he was looking for. He grabbed Luqman by the arm without a moment's hesitation and dragged him home, shouting and accusing, entirely certain he had found his property. And Luqman, a man who had counseled kings, healed the sick for decades, and whose name had traveled across nations, said nothing. He offered no argument. He raised no protest. He submitted to the situation with a patience that can only be described as extraordinary, and waited, with eyes that had seen far worse, for the truth to surface on its own. When the nobleman eventually realized his mistake, he released Luqman with embarrassment and disbelief. For the 3rd time in one life, Luqman was set free. Throughout his long and relentless journeys, Luqman had developed a mastery of the plant world that Islamic tradition compares directly to the miracle granted to the Prophet Sulaiman. Peace be upon him. The ability to understand the language of animals. Just as Sulaiman heard what creatures communicated to one another, Luqman heard what plants communicated. Each herb, he believed with absolute conviction, carried within it a message about the ailment it had been created to heal. He understood that Allah had fashioned thousands of plants across the earth, each one bearing a distinct healing quality, collectively capable of addressing hundreds upon hundreds of different human diseases. This was not merely botanical observation. It was a living theology, a belief that the natural world was itself a form of revelation, a continuous expression of divine mercy made tangible through root and leaf and bark. Islamic tradition honors him as the founding father of herbal and mineral medicine, the man whose understanding of the relationship between creation and healing has never been fully surpassed. The most legendary and most debated chapter of his entire life concerns his search for what many describe as the elixir of immortality. But scholars have consistently urged caution in interpreting this literally. A man of Luqman as spiritual depth, a man who had sat in the gatherings of a prophet, who had meditated for years on the nature of existence, would certainly have understood what the Qur'an teaches clearly: that death is not an ending, but a beginning, that the true and eternal life lies beyond the boundary that this world cannot cross. It is therefore far more probable, scholars suggest, that what Luqman was seeking was not immortality itself, but its earthly approximation, a secret of extraordinary longevity, an elixir that might extend the years of life and preserve the health of the body. The distinction matters. One is a denial of divine decree, the other is a scientist's question, and Allah in all cases knows best. The story is set in the ancient region of Misis, in what is now the southern Turkish province of Adana, a land blessed with one of the richest concentrations of medicinal plants in the known world. Luqman had settled there precisely because of this abundance, continuing to heal the sick and refine his knowledge while pursuing the deeper secret that still eluded him. One afternoon, leaning against the broad trunk of an ancient plane tree near the old stone bridge of Mises, lost in the particular quality of silence that only deep thinkers inhabit, he heard something rise from among the vegetation around him. A voice, or something close enough to a voice that it stopped his breathing. A flower he had never encountered before, unlike anything in his extensive catalogue of plants, was speaking to him. And what it said was this: "The secret, you have spent so many years pursuing lives within me." Luqman rose immediately. He moved toward the plant with the controlled urgency of a man who has waited a very long time for this moment. He listened as it revealed what it knew, step by step, layer by layer. And he recorded every detail in the small notebook he always carried close to his body. The formula that had evaded him across decades of searching was now written in his own hand. He held it. He felt the weight of it. Overcome with a joy so complete, it must have felt almost disorienting, he turned and rushed back across the bridge toward home. Then the wind came. It arrived without warning, sudden, sharp, and precise in a way that felt almost deliberate. It tore the notebook from his hands and sent it spinning out over the railing of the bridge and into the dark waters of the Mises River below. He ran. He reached the edge. He watched the notebook turn in the current and sink. He did not retrieve it. Days passed. He searched the riverbanks with the methodical attention of a man who had spent a lifetime reading what the natural world offered him. Eventually, on a distant bank downstream, he found a single torn page, wrinkled, partially dissolved, barely legible. Some scholars of tradition believe that it was from this single surviving fragment that the science of medicine, as the world came to know it, began to take its first coherent shape. A single page from a notebook that the river reclaimed. All that extraordinary knowledge distilled into one torn remnant. There is something in that story that feels less like accident and more like a message about the nature of human striving and divine sovereignty. Luqman lived for 1,000 years. He traveled across the world, from the Nile Valley to Egypt, from Palestine to Anatolia, from Babylon to the edges of the known earth, healing the sick, teaching the seeking, and diffusing his understanding of medicine into every civilization that would receive it. To this day, across vast regions of the world from the Middle East to Central Asia to the African continent, he is remembered and honored as the father of traditional medicine, the man whose relationship with the natural world opened doors that human beings are still walking through. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, invoked Luqman's name and his wisdom on multiple recorded occasions. In one hadith preserved in both Bukhari and Muslim, when the companions grew troubled upon hearing the Quranic verse about those who mix their faith with wrongdoing, fearing that none of them could claim freedom from self-harm, the Prophet calmed their fear by quoting Luqman's own words to his son. "O my son, do not associate anything with Allah, for shirk is a tremendous injustice." The wrongdoing referenced in the verse, the Prophet clarified, was shirk, the association of partners with Allah, not the ordinary human failures and shortcomings that every believer carries. In another hadith, he described Luqman in the most intimate terms: a servant who reflected deeply and continuously upon the power and majesty of Allah, whose faith was admirable in its quality and consistency, who loved Allah, and whom Allah loved in return. And the narration of Bukhari and Muslim records the Prophet asking his companions directly, "Do you know where Luqman came from?" They deferred, as they always did in matters of deep knowledge. Allah and his messenger know best. He told them, Luqman was from the Habasha. He was dark-skinned, and it was through the wisdom that Allah granted him that his rank rose above what any lineage or social position could have provided. The Qur'an preserves his counsel to his son across Surah Luqman, verses 12 through 19, and what is recorded there stands as one of the most complete and most timeless blueprints for human character and moral formation ever set down in any language. Read it slowly, and you realize that Luqman was not simply offering his child practical advice. He was constructing a full architecture of the righteous human soul, the beliefs it must hold, the relationships it must honor, the disciplines it must practice, and the character it must embody. He began, as all truth must begin, with the foundation, the absolute oneness of Allah. Do not, under any pressure, from any direction, for any reason, associate partners with the divine. He did not say this as a theological abstraction. He said it as a father who understood that shirk is not merely a religious error. It is a disorientation at the deepest level of the self, a confusion about what is real, what is worthy of ultimate loyalty, and what is not. Sheikh Rabi al-Madkhali, in his commentary on this passage, draws the parallel to the approach of the Prophet himself, who instructed Mu'adh ibn Jabal when sending him to the people of the book. Begin with the testimony that there is no deity worthy of worship but Allah. Start where everything else starts, with the truth about who deserves your complete and undivided devotion. Then Luqman addressed gratitude. And here, he elevated it far beyond the level of polite acknowledgement. He connected gratitude to Allah directly and inseparably to gratitude toward parents, as though the two cannot be properly understood in isolation from each other. His mother, he reminded his son, carried him through progressive waves of weakness and exhaustion, a physical and emotional investment that no child fully comprehends until they are old enough to look back and understand what was given. Her body was the vessel. Her sleepless nights were the price. Her anxiety and her love were inseparable from each other. 2 full years of nursing, 2 years of her life poured into the formation of his. Ibn Kathir, in his Tafsir, expands on this with characteristic depth. Allah mentions how the mother raises her child, the fatigue and the stress of watching over him day and night, in order to awaken in the child's heart an awareness of what was sacrificed, so that gratitude is not merely spoken, but genuinely felt. Yet even here, Luqman drew a line that cannot be crossed. If parents, in their love, or their ignorance or their fear, demand that their child abandon the truth and bow to what has no authority before Allah, then obedience to them in this specific matter ends. Sheikh Mahdi Ali comments on this with striking clarity. If they guide you toward Allah, they deserve your compliance. But if they strive to lead you away from Him, then no obedience is owed in that specific domain. What does not end, however, what must never end, regardless of what they do or demand, is the general obligation of kindness, provision, and compassionate presence, even if they are disbelievers, even if they threaten, manipulate, or attempt to harm. The duty to be good to them remains intact. The story of Sa'd ibn Malik, preserved by Ibn Kathir from the narration of Tabarani, makes this vivid and almost unbearably real. His mother, watching her son embrace Islam, threatened to refuse all food and drink until she died of starvation, turning his love for her into a weapon against his faith. He refused with grief in his heart, "O my mother, by Allah, even if you had 100 souls, and they departed from you one by one, I would not abandon my religion." She ate eventually, but the verse had been revealed about him, and it stands in the Qur'an to this day as an instruction about the exact contour of the line between love for parents and loyalty to Allah. Then Luqman said something to his son that cuts cleanly through every generation and every culture. Something that carries no expiration date. Not a single deed, however microscopic, however deeply hidden, falls outside the knowledge of Allah. Even if it is the weight of a mustard seed, even if it is buried inside a rock, even if it exists somewhere in the heavens or deep within the earth, Allah will bring it forth. Allah will place it on the scales of justice. Ibn Kathir explains, every action, good or evil, no matter how trivial it seems to the one who performed it, will be presented and weighed on the day of resurrection. The one who did good will be rewarded. The one who did evil will be held accountable. This is not a threat designed to produce paralysis. It is a truth designed to produce presence. The sustained awareness that every moment matters because every moment is seen. And from this awareness, Luqman drew the full framework of active righteousness. Establish prayer, he told his son, for it is the pillar of all that follows. Command what is good, al-ma'ruf, and forbid what is evil, al-munkar. Shaykh ibn Taymiyyah defines al-ma'ruf as encompassing everything that Allah and His Prophet have permitted and approved, inwardly and outwardly. Al-munkar is its opposite, everything that has been prohibited. The obligation to uphold this distinction, Ibn Taymiyyah argues, must be fulfilled according to one's actual capacity. Sometimes through direct action, sometimes through clear speech, sometimes, when nothing else is possible, through the silent refusal of the heart to approve what the hands and voice cannot stop. The Prophet confirmed this in Sahih Muslim. Whoever among you sees something wrong being committed, let him correct it with his hand. If he cannot, then with his tongue. And if he cannot, then at minimum with his heart, and that is the weakest expression of faith. But Luqman was wise enough, deeply enough experienced in the world, to know that this obligation does not come without cost. Ibn Kathir observes it precisely. Luqman knew that whoever takes seriously the duty of commanding good and forbidding evil will inevitably attract hostility, resentment, and deliberate harm from those who do not wish to be confronted. He had lived this himself. He had been imprisoned for it. He had been enslaved for it. He had been slandered for it across multiple countries and multiple lifetimes. And so the counsel that followed was not abstract. It was the testimony of a man who had been through it. Be patient. Endure with patience whatever comes to you. This is among the most important of the commands. Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah articulates what Luqman already embodied. Patience is not passive resignation. It is an active and deliberate choice to remain upright in the face of what seeks to bend you. The noble person embraces it willingly, understanding that panic does not undo what has been decreed, that impatience does not retrieve what has been lost, and that endurance is not the absence of feeling, but the mastery of it. The Prophet himself left no ambiguity about its value. No gift has ever been granted to any human being that is more complete or more excellent than patience. And finally, after everything, after the theology and the gratitude and the justice and the endurance, Luqman closed his counsel to his son with a warning about the inner disease that quietly destroys all the rest: pride. Do not turn your face away from people with contempt, he said, as though their presence is beneath your acknowledgement. Do not walk upon the earth with insolence, as though the ground you tread belongs to you alone. Allah does not love those who are arrogant, those who boast. Be moderate in your movement, lower your voice, for the harshest and most graceless of all sounds is the braying of a donkey, and the one who shouts to impose himself on others has made himself its human equivalent. The Prophet, in Sahih Muslim, left a warning about this that reverberates through centuries. Whoever carries even an atom's weight of pride in his heart will not enter paradise. A man asked, "But what of a person who simply loves to wear beautiful clothing and fine shoes? Is that pride?" The Prophet answered carefully, drawing a line that matters. No, Allah is beautiful and loves beauty. Pride is something else entirely. Pride is the rejection of truth and the contempt for other people. Those are its two faces, and they are both deadly. Sheikh Abdul Rahman ibn Nasir Saddi adds a further distinction of importance. To reject the truth of Allah and His Messenger entirely, out of arrogance, that is kufr, disbelief. But to resist or deflect the truth partially, out of preference for one's own opinion, that while falling short of disbelief, remains a punishable offense before Allah. The line between them is thinner than many people realize. Muslim Ibn Taymiyyah offers the spiritual counterpoint that gives this warning its full meaning. The more a believer humbles himself before Allah, the more genuinely, consistently and deeply he submits. The closer he draws to Him, the more beloved he becomes in His sight, and the higher his true station rises. There is a divine inversion at the heart of this principle. In the human world, pride is the mechanism by which people try to elevate themselves. Before Allah, it is the surest path downward. And humility, which the world mistakes for weakness, is the exact quality through which the believer rises to the highest stations. And so ends the extraordinary life of Luqman, a man who arrived in this world with absolutely nothing, who was enslaved 3 times and freed 3 times, who carried wisdom in his chest through prison walls and desert roads and the courts of kings, who walked beside a prophet and learned from herbs and flowers and the sound of a river carrying away what he had spent decades seeking. A man who lived 1,000 years and used every one of them in service of something larger than himself. A man whose name Allah preserved in the Qur'an, not because he was flawless, not because he was superhuman, but because he chose, consistently, persistently, across a life of extraordinary difficulty, to remain oriented toward the truth. His counsel to his son is not ancient history, it is a living document. It is It is speaking directly to you right now, across 3,000 years of distance, with a clarity that has not faded by a single degree. If this story moved you, if something in it reached a part of you that needed to be reached, do not let that feeling disappear quietly. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell us, which piece of Luqman's wisdom hit you hardest? Which counsel do you find most difficult to apply in your own life? Subscribe so that stories like this one continue to find you. Because this is exactly the kind of knowledge that the world needs more of, not less. And every single person you share it with carries it a little further into the world. Don't let it stop here.